300 guests. A tent, the size of a ballroom. A front row seat, kept empty, with a single envelope resting on a tan envelope, with handwriting so familiar it was almost a dare. The cameras were trained down the aisle. The string quartet had taken their places, and for a moment the room held its breath, waiting for whatever spectacle the groom had arranged for his ex-wife to witness. It was supposed to be humiliation served on china. It was supposed to be one final act of control. If you love stories of quiet triumph, subscribe. Adais Mensada, to everyone who loved her, was not in that ballroom. She was 3 bus rides away, bent over a thrifted sewing machine, in a room the size of a pantry, the light above her flickering like a cautious promise. Her twins were asleep on the thin mattress in the next room. Their slow, even breathing was the only music she allowed herself to accept as safe. On the kitchen counter, folded under a music book and a jar of mending thread, lay an envelope with her name in the same looping script she had seen in a dozen texts and dinner invitations. The return address was extravagant, the paper thick, the kind of stationery meant to announce power. Ada turned the envelope over with fingers that still remembered the first time she had threaded a needle, as if it were a memory rather than a skill her hands had always known how to make things hold. A scrap of gold thread had fallen into her palm earlier that morning. She had twisted it around her index finger and watched it glitter like a tiny sun. It had become her talisman, an ordinary thing that meant the world was repairable. She could have let the page stay closed. She could have let whatever the envelope contained be someone else's weapon, but she had been taught, by the slow logic of survival and the faster logic of motherhood, that things addressed to you demanded to be opened. So she slit the flap with the blunt edge of her fingernail and unfolded the card. October 14th. The date sat like a pinpoint. Beneath it, formal script spelled out the location, the time, the RSVP, then, in a scrawled line, meant to sting, an instruction. Please come. There is a seat, waiting in the front row. For a second, she imagined the hand that had written it, the same hand that had once tucked a napkin into her collar at a restaurant and called her my wife, with a smile that convinced her the world had reshaped to fit them. The same hand that had handed her the keys to a condo, and the same hand that later insisted on holding every receipt, every signature, every choice. The handwriting had been charm and ownership in equal parts. She set the card down. The sewing machine hummed like a distant city. In another life before, she learned how few people notice the sound of a sewing machine at 3 a.m. She might have let the invitation be the punctuation mark to a story someone else had decided. Instead, she put the envelope in the drawer with the gold thread spool, closed it, and went to check on the girls. Amara and Zuri slept with their arms thrown out like 2 small stars, their faces soft and unconcerned. Ada smoothed the blanket over their shoulders and felt, for a breath, something that leaned toward peace. She had not always had this. She had once thought a name like Adai's would be enough to stake a claim on the world. She had once thought Love Shanetto's smooth laugh, his promises would be the map. The map had burned. The story of how she had come to that kitchen, to that sewing machine, to those twins, could be told in many ways, as a lesson, as a wound, as a triumph. What it felt like minute by minute, after the lights were off and the twins were asleep, was mostly a stack of small, stubborn choices. Pick a job, feed the kids, keep the house clean enough to avoid inspections, find work that made her hands hurt less and her heart ache less. Keep breathing. It had begun with a charm the way many bad storms begin, slow and flattering. Chinedu Ora had the sort of confidence that made his clothes look like they had been tailored to make him more powerful. He slid into conversation at a market stall like a man who had practiced 3 versions of apology and owned a better one. He bought Ada a cup of sugar once out of convenience, he said. Out of attention, she later realized. He praised her sewing in a way no one had, not as a cheap craft but as if she was an artist who had accidentally set up shop in a neighborhood that could not yet see the work. They married in a small ceremony at first, and then the marriage learned how to grow public. The dinners, the photos, the way people leaned back when he arrived and leaned forward when he spoke, the collapse of private tenderness into public theater was gradual. Ada, who had learned to measure value by the seams she created, began to measure a different way, by how his gaze softened when she explained a technique, by how he introduced her to people with a word that made her sound like an accessory. Control had many quiet stages. It began with jokes about her thrifted coats, with subtle corrections in front of friends. It moved into financial decisions made in the name of security until the accounts were hers in name only and his in substance. It was a calendar full of his appointments and very few of hers. It was, finally, an instruction that all of her work had to be cleared through him if permission was the only market she could sell in. Her notebooks became audited. Her customers began receiving messages from his number offering to handle things. He would tell her, in private, that the world would respect them only if he managed their image. You cannot argue with a mirror that does not reflect what it sees. The fracture came in the night of things not named. There was an argument that was all business and cruelty. There was the final raising of a hand that made Ada understand, in a way she would never unlearn, that staying was a form of death. She left with a diaper bag, with 2 small sleeping bodies, with the only thing she had never let him touch, her sewing box, worn and soft by years of use. No dramatic fight, no cinematic pause. Just a woman who had learned that the best way to safeguard little futures was to exit the room where futures were being auctioned. For a while, shelter was a collection of temporary addresses, friends who folded themselves into kind offers, a church basement with an evening bed, a corner of a cousin's flat where the twins could be noisy without the watchful eyes of anyone who would count noise as a sin. They slept in the back of a borrowed car once, the world around them muffled, because sometimes rest is the only thing that feels like currency you can still spend. She paid landlords in altered hems and in the small gifts of a repaired hemline. She grew used to the weight of being pitied and the lighter, stranger freedom of no longer being in his orbit. She returned to the machine, the way breath returns to lungs after surfacing. It felt like an old language she had forgotten how to use and then remembered in an instant. Customers came asking for adjustments. Small repairs, the kind of work others dismissed as trivial. $10 here, $20 there. It was not wealth. It was not even dignity, as the magazines sell it. It was daily life paid back in coins, and the steady rhythm of fabric sliding under her foot. Every stitch was a vote against erasure. Every hem she mended was an argument. The world might have tried to mark her disposable, but she still possessed the skill to make whole. The gold thread became a metaphor because sometimes a metaphor is the only language left after what has been lost. She used a tiny spool saved from a dress Chinidu had once praised, a remnant of a time when his compliments tasted like currency and not restraint. Gold thread was ridiculous to most customers, too showy for an alteration, too precious for a patch. Ada loved it because it twinkled under the lamplight and because it reminded her that worth could be stitched at home, on a small machine, in the middle of the night. The twins kept her steady. Amara had her mother's mouth sharp. Practical Nzuri had her laugh. A tiny bell that could cut through any room. Both of them loved the simple, ordinary things that the world often forgets to cherish. The way a bowl of jollof rice could cheer a bad day. The ritual of 2 little hands tracing the hem of a skirt before bed. The way Ada could turn an old shirt into a whole new dress with just a few confident cuts. They were her protests and her proof. People who watched from a distance assumed divorce meant relief or scandal. In Ada's world, it meant paperwork and court dates, and a small monthly payment that clinked like a polygonot, enough to cover the rent, but enough to keep the doors open if she did not let fear make its home there. Chinadu sent $300 a month for a while, an amount presented like generosity and calibrated to shackle. He told people it was a form of support. He told others he had helped her on the way up and dismissed her as an ex-wife who had had her turn. It would have been easy, some nights, to trade her dignity for quicker money. Offers came packaged as expedients, work that would sell faster if she altered her designs to echo the styles he favored. Collaborations that required him to be the face. Each time, she refused. It was not arrogance. It was the economy of a woman who had learned that making a little less money for more of herself was a better investment than selling a future she had only just begun to rebuild. The first time she saw Kofi Asante, it was in a small, overcrowded fabric market that smelled of starch and sunlight. He stood in front of a shelf of kente cloth, looking like a man who loved texture but was allergic to spectacle. He did not arrive like someone who owned buildings and balance sheets. He was the kind of person who could disappear into the crowd if he wished to, which suited him. He reached for a bolt of fabric, and his hand hovered as if he was listening to it. Ada was measuring a hem. Her hands moved with the certainty of practice. She had a small sign in the window, mesa designs, and a stack of business cards that had her number and an email address people rarely used. A customer asked about the kente for a christening. The young man Kofi asked her, gently and without pretense, whether she recommended a certain weave. They started with fabrics, because that is how makers know each other. Conversation began as commerce. Then it became a series of small attentions. Kofi asked about her work in a way that did not sound like pity or research. He noticed the way she tightened the thread on the machine when she was thinking. He remembered the twins' names. He complimented a seam, and meant it. Their early meetings were spare and honest too, people who liked craft, who liked children, who liked Sunday markets. They shared coffee on stoops, watched the girls play with a frayed doll, and sometimes walked in silence that felt companionable rather than awkward. There were no grand declarations early on. Kofi did not build a ballroom around them. He brought sandwiches and a thermos and listened to Ada when she talked about fabric weights and bias cuts like someone learning a new language. After the quiet of fear, Ada found the slow pleasure of being heard to be its own kind of luxury. Kofi's kindness did not flash. It accumulated. He borrowed tools for her, left small notes with repair jobs he had found for her, nothing that announced generosity. Only gestures that made a life easier. The people around him thought it was curiosity at first, then friendship. Ada, wary from years of charm that ended in ledger books and confessions of ownership, kept her walls measured and practical. But when someone notices the small things like a mother's favorite coffee shop or the exact time a child takes a nap, that noticing becomes a language of care. He did not speak of money. When he paid for a cloth, he did not flaunt his hand. He asked her once whether she would ever consider opening a proper studio, a place with light and room for 2 machines and a shelf for the twin girls to do their homework. She told him the idea sounded like something both painfully expensive and impossibly lovely. He smiled and said, "I like the sound of it." He did not elaborate. Ada liked him for reasons that had nothing to do with the numbers he might keep in a private ledger. She liked that he never asked about her past, as if it were a scandal to be verified. He accepted the fact that she had left and had a life complicated by 2 small people who needed her. He arrived as someone who saw her as a person whose talents could be steady bread, that, more than any check, made the kind of future that could stand. Then the invitation arrived. It should have been ordinary mail card announcing a day and a place, but it arrived like a stone thrown through sleep. The handwriting on the envelope was deliberately neat, an echo of his taste for fine things. Ada had been cutting a hem when she first noticed it on the doormat. Pale and confident against a summer of bills and grocery lists, she picked it up with sticky fingers and felt a small, old panic settle into her ribs. She could have collected it as an ordinary citizen might. Fold it into the pocket of her apron, show her friend Nkichi, toss it into the bin that contained junk and old receipts. Instead, she brought it inside, sat at the small table, and read the formal language like a map leading to a crossroad. There was an absurd theater to it. A wedding invitation that asked for the presence of someone who had been, by a legal decree, no longer connected to the man who sent it. It felt like a game he wanted an audience. The instruction to come felt less like an offer than a command dipped in smugness. Nkichi, who had been Ada's friend since childhood and had folded 1,000 practical confidences into their friendship, looked at the invitation and snorted. "He wants curious faces," he said. "He wants to put you under a glass. Don't let him make you into an ornament." Ada held the card and thought of her daughters, their faces at their first day of school, the way they imitated her when she curved a hem, the way Zuri would keep drawing suns on every scrap of paper. Amara had asked once whether their mother would ever wear a fancy dress again, an ordinary wish, said by a small person who equated dresses with birthdays and hope. She thought of the gold thread spool and how foolish it had been to keep such a thing after everything else had been taken. She found the little coil in the drawer, lifted it into the light. and watched it catch and fracture the afternoon like a small promise. The invitation was taunt and map both. It asked her to be seen on their terms. Her first instincts were practical. Burn it. Throw it away. Forget that a man who had once tried to define her still wanted to stage her life for an audience. Her second instincts were complicated by the physics of motherhood, by the knowledge that the girls had a right to see their mother exist in public, to be an unashamed presence. She wanted closure in a life that had been denied it. She wanted to stand still and say only what her hands would say. That she could build, that she could sew, that she could be whole without his permission. Enkichi wanted a plan. He suggested various small rebellions. Show up with a cardboard sign, bring a camera, bring the twins, and make them do a victory dance in the aisle. Ada listened and smiled. But nothing in her wanted a childish spectacle. She had survived spectacles that humiliated her. She did not want to create another. Her work had taught her the subtlety of good taste of how a stitch could lift a hem without shouting. Inside her, the question rose like steam. What would it mean to go? Would she be consenting to an old script if she sat in the appointed chair and opened the card? Or could she change the meaning of the chair itself by choosing how to occupy it? These were questions about agency more than revenge. She had never been one for public tantrums. She preferred to reclaim by building. Kofi's visits became the backdrop against which this decision played. He noticed the envelope on the table one afternoon and, without comment, brewed coffee. He sat, leaned forward, and asked her the simple question. Do you want to go? It was the kind of directness Ada admired. It asked about desire, not duty. It treated her like someone whose choices mattered. She told him that she did not know, that the thought frightened her, and also held a glittering, impossible comfort. She said she was tired of being bait. He listened. He did not insist that she must show up in a gown to prove that she mattered. He asked a single practical question instead. If you go, how would you want to be seen? The answer came out before she could stack the reasons to refuse. Like a woman who built her life back with her hands, she said. Not like a costume made to make someone else feel bigger? Kofi smiled and said nothing grand. He suggested small, precise things. A dress that she made, not one he or anyone else could buy off a shelf. A way to arrive that felt dignified rather than staged. Presence without spectacle. He spoke of company and protection in the abstract, like someone proposing practical insurance rather than a headline. Ada felt something relieve inside her that was not just relief but permission. Someone had offered a hand without the glare of pity. She breached no illusions if she accepted help in the form of a ride or a quiet companion. The point, she decided, was not to outshine anyone but to refuse to be stripped of dignity. She began the work she always did when she meant to make something true. She designed. The dress started with a scrap of old kente her mother had given her and the gold thread wound around a bobbin like a small crescent moon. She wanted the gown to say what words could not. That stitching could be armor. That craft could be statement. It was not a price tag. It was the evidence of a life earned stitch by stitch. For weeks, she worked at odd hours, measuring, pinning, unsettling the old lines until they yielded. The dress was not ostentatious. She refused that. It was not meant to flaunt anyone's wealth. Instead, it was meticulous clean seams, a line that spoke of understated confidence, a sash of kente that fell like a river. Gold thread traced the hem and the neckline in tiny, deliberate stitches that caught the light and winked without arrogance. Her friends saw the dress, and saw something they recognized. Not a costume, but a reclamation. The twins would run their fingers along the hem and laugh, and Ada would tell them that good things were made slowly. Enkichi joked that she was making a wedding dress that would make people wonder who had really done the designing. Word of her work circulated in the small world of tailors and Mother Zeta Mensa, who could take a tired dress and make it sing. A local reporter did a short, 10-second spot on a charity fair where she had volunteered. A neighbor shared a photo online. The internet, which has a way of making small things blink into larger things, began to notice her name. It was not fame. It was the first glint of light on the horizon. Kofi was present in all of it without making a banner. He helped in small ways, offering to pick up fabric bolts when the market ran low, finding a spool of thread she had been missing, staying for dinner, when Enkichi's jokes grew loud enough to make the twins giggle. He never referred to himself as a benefactor. He never asked her for rights to the designs, for interviews, for anything that would make her owe him. He existed as an ally, a listener whose presence made the home feel like a place where decisions could be hers. As the wedding day October 14th approached, the envelope in the drawer grew like a small, sedate storm cloud in her mind. It sat at the intersection of past and present. She worried not that the groom might humiliate her, she expected that, but that, in his performance, he might steal the story of what it had taken to arrive at that moment. She wanted to be seen correctly, not as a woman redeemed by wealth or rescued by a man with deep pockets, but as someone who had rebuilt with her own hands and who chose, on her own terms, how to present herself to the world. The invitation, though written like a command, had gifted her an unexpected choice. It had offered a stage she had no obligation to accept, but if she did step onto it, she resolved to make a different kind of spectacle, a show of quiet competence that could not be weaponized. On the morning the groom expected his ex-wife to show up and be used for whatever theater he had imagined, Ada sat at her kitchen table and cut the final length of fabric. The sunshine through the window made the gold thread look like a thin river. The twins were off at school, primed by their mother with sandwiches and the promise of a small celebration if they behaved. She had packed her sewing kit and a small packet of needles and, in a separate bag, the finished dress, folded carefully with tissue paper between the folds so no crease would mar the line. She did not tell the twins about the invitation. There was no conversation with them about revenge. There was only a domestic seriousness speck. Your lunch, kiss your mother, behave, and remember that you are loved. It was such ordinary instruction that anyone who observed might miss the tremor of meaning under it. She thought of Chinadu with a long and steady exhale. He had once said, in a tone that no longer carried weight, that she was petty for keeping certain sprigs of her old life a spool here, an old photograph there. He had wanted everything to be clean and manageable. Nothing left to remind him that another life had existed parallel to the one he curated. Ada folded the invitation into an envelope, put it in her purse, and walked out the door with her hands smelling faintly of fabric and starch. She could have taken a taxi and been there in an hour. She could have avoided the spectacle altogether and let him have his elaborate party. She chose instead the one small thing that felt like the product of someone who had been thinking long-term. She would go because she wanted to show herself in public, to test the idea that a life rebuilt on one's own terms could stand under scrutiny. On the bus, she kept her chin down and watched the city rearrange itself outside the window. Vendors called, people argued about trivial things, and the twins hummed with the energy they always carried. Kofi had offered to accompany her, to be a quiet presence. He had not offered to take center stage. She appreciated the offer and asked him to be beside her, not because she needed someone to prove her value, but because there is a kind of courage that is easier to exercise when someone else notices you and does not try to own the notice. They arrived at the venue early. The hotel lobby was a study in polish. Marble floors that reflected the chandeliers like water, staff moving with the precision of a clock. There was a line of cars outside, and the name Chinadu Awara had been printed on menus and signage as if to claim the ceremony itself as brand. People glanced and whispered, a social ballet, and Ada noticed how often a whisper tried to make her small, even in a room where size had little to do with truth. When they found the reserved front row seat, Ada saw the envelope. It was placed with a small, theatrical deliberation right at the edge of the aisle. Someone had written on the card inside, in ink that had the practiced cruelty of someone comfortable making an audience out of private pain. It read, plainly and intended to wound, a line that reduced marriage to a show and made her the opposite of what she was. Ada slid the card from its envelope and read quietly, without theatrics. The moment was cruel in the way that ordinary cruelty often is, intended to startle, to hollow out, to make someone feel less in the presence of others. The hall was full of people who had come to watch a story they were convinced was simple. She could have left then and there. She could have left the front row seat empty and returned to her life quietly. She could have let the invitation be proof that the man who had once tried to bind her still believed he had the right to name her sorrow. Instead, she sat down. Sitting was a decision that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with occupying a space that had once been used to diminish her. The chair was soft and politely embroidered, the kind of chair that announced comfort and approval. The room smelled faintly of roses and cologne. People smiled politely at her, like they were part of a scene that needed an extra prop. She kept her hands folded in her lap, felt the gold thread in her pocket like a compass, and watched the ceremony begin. There was a sense of theater to it, all a carefully staged life that had been rehearsed and polished until nothing in it could conjure real surprise. Chinadu entered the room like a man who had mastered the skill of making himself look inevitable. Guests stood. Someone pressed a camera in a direction that made everything look larger, and the orchestra took a phrase and swelled it until the air felt full. Ada listened to the music with a peculiar clarity. It had been used once to underscore his triumphs, banquets, openings, photographs taken with politicians and developers. Now, it was being used in service of a moment intended to finalize another's pleasure. She did not let it swallow her. She breathed and reminded herself of the small things. The pattern of stitches she had placed on the hem. The way the twins would tell their friends a week later about the store where their mother stitched magic. The quiet knowledge that her work could not be erased. Across the aisle, in a place close enough that the hem of his suit brushed the air, Chinadu looked as though he had been carved from ambition. He caught her eye once a fraction of an instant tan. Ada saw the familiar glide of a man who believed his own press. There was arrogance there. Yes, and the old practiced smile that had once made her think herself lucky. Now it looked brittle against the reality of what she had built. She did not stand when called upon. She did not create a scene. She sat, breathed, and let the people who had come to witness whatever they thought they would witness hold their assumptions in their hands like brittle glass. The invitation had been thrown like a gauntlet. She had picked it up and decided, quietly and with intention, what to do with it. When the ceremony moved forward, the room tightened its attention. Ada felt that tightening as if it were a physical sensation along her skin. She kept her gaze steady and remembered the way Amara had once traced the pattern of a hem and a napkin and pronounced it beautiful. Memory is a strange kind of armor. It presses into the present and reshapes how one stands in public. Afterward, after vows and clinking glasses and speeches that spoke in numbers and projections, there would be photographs and toasts and the social media clippings that make a life look finished. But for now, in that first hour, Ada sat and watched as a life she had been part of 4 years made itself into a narrative that belonged to him alone. She felt no urge to reclaim the whole story. She wanted only to be present in the way she chose. Steady, unashamed, refusing to be performed upon. When the time came to leave, she folded herself into the rhythm of small movements, collecting the twins, answering a neighbor's awkward question, making the short walk to the car. The envelope lay folded into a pocket of her purse like a small, dangerous fossil. The night air felt clean and heavy with incense and perfume. People who had assembled to watch a spectacle scattered into taxis and low murmurs. As she slid into the passenger seat of the modest car, Kofi had arranged no showy sedans, no arriving to announce status. She felt the familiar tremor of being seen. It was not the tremor of fear, but of possibility. The invitation lay between them on the seat. A small paper with an old intention and a new audience. Kofi glanced at it and then at her, with an expression that was careful and kind. He did not offer to explain himself in any grand way. He simply said, "Whatever you choose to do, I'm here." She folded her hands around the gold thread spool in her bag, felt the thread pressed into her palm, and for a second the world went quiet in the way it does before a stitch is pulled and the cloth gives shape. The invitation trembled in her purse, heavy with history and threat. She had the right to refuse it. She had the right to occupy the chair on her terms. She had the right to keep sewing, to build, to be tender with the twins, and precise with her seams. When they drove away from the glitter and the cameras, the city lights smeared into a long, indifferent stream. The future was, as it had always been, for Ida, measured by small things. The steady hum of her machine, the safe sleep of the twins, the way her hands remembered to make things last. The envelope was a question left unanswered on the kitchen table of a life that had begun to rearrange itself. She thought of her mother, who had once mended shirts for neighbors, and never let her faith in small work erode. She thought of the gold thread again, which was not flashy but luminous in the way it carried light. The invitation had been an attempt at spectacle. Ada had chosen to handle it like a maker. The choice was hers. At home, with the twins tucked into bed and the sewing machine humming a gentle lullaby, she sat at the table and opened the drawer where she had tucked the invitation. The room smelled of starch and lemon, and the faint perfume of a life that had decided to keep going. She laid the card flat and smoothed the single scrawl of ink as if it were a map she had yet to read. It would have to wait until morning. Outside, the city breathed on. Inside, Ada threaded the machine and began a new seam. A small, meticulous work that would take more than an evening to complete. The gold thread shone in the light as she stitched, and each tiny knot felt like a statement. There was a decision ahead, heavy with the weight of past hurts and the possibility of dignity reclaimed. She did not know, then, if she would respond to the invitation with silence or with a presence. She only knew that when she stood in public again she would do so on her terms, by the rules she set, and with the craft that had kept her alive. The envelope waited in the drawer like a quiet accusation. The date October 14th rested on the page like a drumbeat. The rest of the story, like the seam she was sewing, had to be approached one stitch at a time. Morning found Ada awake before the light. The gold thread on her work table seemed to hum as if the tiny coil remembered the night's conversation and wanted to be ready for whatever came next. She folded the dress into careful layers, smoothed the tissue between them, and slid it into a box she could carry beneath her arm like a promise. There was a quiet steadiness to her movements, habit, practiced, a kind of devotion to small details that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with truth. Kofi arrived to pick her up in a car that did not scream for attention. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee and a long, practical umbrella against the chance of rain. There was nothing in his manner to suggest he kept entire buildings or investment portfolios. His clothes were simply good, the sort that weathered life rather than announcing it. He looked at Ada with an expression that had become familiar, an attention that did not press, that listened like a hand at the back of a chair, steady, respectful. "Are you sure?" he asked. She answered by lifting the box slightly, as if to say, "This is what I made my hand for." "I am," she said. "I am sure I will be myself." They walked up the stone steps together. Guests were arriving in layers of silk and tuxedo and practiced politeness. Photographers arranged themselves like small storms of flashes. The reserved seat gleamed at the edge of the aisle, a deliberate omission that still had the power to sting. For a moment, Ada paused at the top of the stairs and breathed in the air perfume and roses and the faint metallic temps of all doves, and she let it settle into a steady rhythm. The gold thread at her side caught a stray sunbeam and flashed like something alive. Then the sound came, the low, effortless sigh of an engine more used to being ignored than admired. A Rolls-Royce eased through the valet lane and settled like a quiet declaration. It did not arrive like a parade. It arrived like someone who had decided to be present and unshowy about it. Men in suits stepped out, not with swagger, but with a calm procedure. They opened doors, checked the path, offered a way through the press. They were not a wall. They were a lane of courtesy. A ripple passed through the crowd. Phones raised. I searched for the source of this new, odd certainty on the pavement. People started to whisper. Vivan's friends leaned forward in their chairs. Chinedu's sister adjusted her necklace as if to anchor herself. The atmosphere tightened like a string ready to pluck. Ada stepped from the car with the dress box tucked under her arm. She kept her face steady. Kofi walked beside her, no ostentation, no arm around her waist, only a quiet presence that said, "I'm here if you need me." The men who had emerged from the rolls formed the respectful corridor, and their discreet solemnity was not the kind of spectacle he had once used to intimidate. It felt, instead, like a practical courtesy for someone who had chosen to stand where she would. She opened the box, unfolded the gown, and eased into it with the sure hands of the maker. The fabric settled, and the gold thread traced the neckline and hem like a small constellation. The dress did not scream. It glowed. Under the light, it seemed to be lit from within, an effect that had nothing to do with price and everything to do with craft. The kente sash fell in a precise river, and the gold stitches winked when the sunlight caught them. When she stepped onto the aisle, the room inhaled. Not a single person made a sound for the first 10 seconds. The orchestra's swell shrank into silence. Cameras paused. The reserved seat, once an empty provocation, suddenly held a woman who had decided how to be present on her own terms. Vivian's laughter, brittle and carefully practiced, thinned into something fragile. For a moment, she looked as if she had been asked to enter a scene whose script she did not know. Chinidu's smile faltered. He had imagined the humiliation would take a certain shape, tears, ruin. As sob in a cheap dress, the shape in front of him was not one he could command. Ada walked with no grand gestures. Her steps were calm. People had expected a worse kind of drama. Instead, they found the opposite. Composure, craft, authority stitched into fabric. She sat in the seat his invitation had reserved and, feeling every gaze like a physical thing, she let the room hold its own expectations while she did something simple and decisive. She reached into her purse, pulled out the folded invitation, and read the line aloud. Her voice steady enough that only her nearest neighbors could hear the words as clearly as if they'd been written on the air. "Please come," she read. "There is a seat waiting in the front row." She placed the card on her lap, and then, with the same care she used for a seam, lifted the hem of her dress a fraction and showed them the inside of the fabric. "This," she said, and her voice held the exact kind of calm that undid pretense, "is made by my hands." She tapped the gold thread at her neckline. "I stitched it myself." The murmur that started was not the loud glee of revenge. It was the sound of people rearranging their stories to fit a reality they had not expected. Enkichi, watching from the back, felt something like relief for her. Kofi, at her side but not ahead of her, watched as the room worked to reconcile what it had been told with what was true. Vivian's face paled. She stood abruptly, made a small, tight smile that fell apart in the space of a breath, and left the aisle. She did not make a scene. She walked away with the practiced precision of someone who had always been practiced at performance. The spectacle she had planned had curdled into an awkward silence she could not recover from. Her retreat felt less like triumph than a strategic withdrawal from a script that refused to flatter. Chinidu rose slowly, as if the movement could reclaim a narrative. He demanded some version of control. He wanted the auditorium to recall that he had the right to stage life as he pleased. The words he reached for an attempt at a joke, a polished barb fell useless into the air. The room seemed to refuse to help him. He fumbled at his notes and found the audience, not with him but watching him as a man who had thought visibility was power and learned, in public, that the kind of visibility that matters is not the one purchased by pageantry. He opened his mouth and closed it. Ada's stillness had the weight of something that could not be answered by spin. He sat back down, smaller in the chair because whatever illusion he'd invested in was now revealed as brittle. No yelling, no shouts, no scenes of humiliation that turned cruel. Ada simply sat. She put the invitation back in its envelope and, with the decorum of someone who had come to be present rather than to allowed the ceremony to continue around her. When the toasts resumed and the music rose, she listened without needing the room to help her feel worthy. Her worth had been stitched by midnight hands in a small kitchen, not decided by a guest list. Later, as guests mingled and phones pinged, a clip of her entrance did what these moments do now. It went out into the small, hungry world of the internet. The footage was not sensational because it did not have to be. It simply showed a woman walking into a place that had tried to script her shame, her shoulders straight, a gown that glimmered with tiny, deliberate stitches. Under the video, comments spun like sparrows, some compassionate, some surprised, some outraged on her behalf. Journalists reached out with polite, curious emails. Friends called. A neighbor posted the photograph that made local pages, then national ones. The next day, the paper press called Kofi a mysterious benefactor and then, less gently, a man of means who preferred to be known by his kindness rather than by his balance sheet. Financial pages, curious by habit, dug and found holdings and companies and numbers that no one in the fabric market would have guessed. Assets that, in cursory reports, measured into the hundreds of millions. The numbers were not important to Ada. What mattered was that his choice had been to respect her agency, not to make her a headline about rescue. Kofi attended nothing like a triumphal entrance. He had been careful to make his presence conditional on her comfort. If any explanation was tendered, it came quietly and without flourish. He told a friend later, over the ironing of a shirt, that he had lived long enough to learn that people are like fabric, some you wear and some you mend, and that he had wanted to know who Ada was without money, reshaping that person. He used a metaphor because that was how makers talk. Ada accepted the thought without making it into a throne. There had been no test he could pass that rewrote the fact that she had made a life with her own hands. The weeks that followed were a slow Mensa Designs, which had been a small name sewn into the cuffs of local life, received attention that translated into real orders. First commissions for tailored work from neighbors, then a call from a boutique who wanted a one-off, then an invitation to teach a workshop. Kofi offered to help with the space, no takeover, only a lease and a grant. That meant Ada would not have to sew in the corner of a crowded living room. She accepted money the way a craftsman accepts good tools, as resources to do better work, not as a title to be carried. The studio was not a temple to excess. It was a sunlit storefront with room for 2 machines and a shelf for the twins to draw on while Ada took measurements. It smelled of starch and lemon and the clean cotton of new projects. Ada hired 2 local women who had once altered school uniforms and now wanted to hone their craft. She taught them how to finish a seam so that it did not fray even under the raggedest of use. The girls came in after school and traced pencil lines onto scrap fabric. They learned to knot the thread just so. The studio was, by design, a place that multiplied dignity rather than hoarded it. Her hands remained at the center of everything. She refused offers to sell the brand to someone who wanted her face as an accessory. She wanted ownership of her craft, plain and Kofi's support came in practical forms. He arranged for the repairs to the front of the shop, arranged a small delivery contract with a store that needed reliable alteration work, and sometimes sat quietly in the back while she taught a class. He did not take credit in press conferences. When asked about his involvement, he once smiled and said simply, "I think good work should be funded." That was all. At the studio opening, Kofi's mother came in, Elda, with a face as open as sun-worn wood and eyes that measured people carefully. She did not speak of money or markets. She came bearing a tray of sweet pastries and a small note that had a line of praise for Ada's workmanship. Her presence felt like a quiet blessing rather than an imp. She pulled Ada aside and said, in a voice that had the patient certainty of those who had seen fortunes come and go, "You keep your hands honest, and no one can buy your peace." Ada folded the words into her pocket like one of those small, necessary tools you keep by the machine. The twins, who had watched their mother stitch late into nights and who had once known fear as an unusual guest at home, now ran through the studio like bright weather. Amara examined a row of hems with adult curiosity and declared, with all the solemnity of children, that their mother made proper magic. Zuri clapped at a finished dress and wanted to try the spare bobbin. They clung to Ida and to the ordinary certainties of food and homework, the same small things that had always anchored them. Recording a simple moment on a phone, Amara said into the camera, "We were always rich." It was not a statement about bank accounts. It was about the richness of hands and presence and how that made a home. Chinedu's empire did not crumble in a single night. Business does not often obey the neat arcs of drama, but the social cost of being revealed as someone who manipulates personal narratives for public applause is real. Clients began to recalibrate who they invited to open new developments. Partners, sensitive to reputation, grew cautious. Journalists contacted his past collaborators and found stories that were at best awkward and at worst instructive. A deal that had been near completion went cold. He protested with the practiced language of a man who had always expected to be believed, and some believed him. But where once he could lean on spectacle to buoy his public life, he now found that spectacle had weight, and that weight can drag you under. He did not come to the studio opening. He watched the headlines from apartments whose windows no longer opened onto people who greeted him with the old deferential nod. He tried, in quieter circles, to present himself as a man misunderstood. The people who had once applauded him found the applause a little harder to give. The money did not evaporate overnight, but the reverence that had been his currency began to thin like fabric left in the sun. Ada never made Chinadu the center of her art. She seldom spoke of him in public, and when she did, it was with the calm clarity of someone marking a seam for future reference. What mattered, she said in one interview, she agreed too short and careful, because she did not want to turn her life into a lesson for strangers, was that my children knew how to live. Everything else was mending. Kofi remained present but unobtrusive. He was not a trophy at her side. He sent flowers to the twins' school on their birthdays and once fixed a leaking pipe in the studio without announcing himself. When asked why he had walked up the stairs in a Rolls or why he had arranged for a respectful, plain security that morning, he said simply that the world is sometimes a place where protection is practical. Ada appreciated the sentiment and reciprocated with the professional courtesy of a colleague. She kept the partnership steady and local. Lunches, shared notes on fabric, a mutual respect for craft. Months later, a feature ran on a morning show. A commentator praised Ada's designs and her refusal to make her life into spectacle. She could have chosen vengeance, the host said, but she chose craft. The segment cut to a clip of the twins, now in school uniforms that Ada had tailored herself, laughing as they stacked spools of thread. Kofi watched from the couch of a small home that smelled of coffee. He did not gloat. He listened to her speak and felt, perhaps, the satisfaction of someone who recognized that the only true splendor in life is when someone else's dignity is respected and allowed to grow. There were offers for collaboration from designers who sought authentic craft. She accepted a few, always on terms that kept Mensa Designs hers. She hosted workshops that taught women how to repair clothing and, more importantly, how to use those skills to create income. She hired 2 apprentices and paid them living wages. Her life had shifted from survival to stewardship. She now had the space to teach others how to make whole things. Ada and the girls took a small trip to the coast one Sunday. The sun was low, and the sea made a slow silver road. Amara ran ahead, her voice reedy with the joy of someone who had rediscovered land. Zuri collected shells and returned triumphant. Ada walked barefoot and let the cold water lap around her ankles. Kofi stood a little way off, hands in his pockets, watching the family that had become something he admired because it had been chosen and built, not purchased. That evening, as the sun bled into pink and the gold thread on Ada's old spool caught the last light, she told the twins a small story about the way things mend. A stitch is just a choice, she said, and they listened because children always love the simplicity that adults complicate. You can use 1 to hide a tear, or you can use 10 to make something stronger. Amara nodded like someone who understood more than she would ever let on in public. Zuri yawned and dropped her head against her mother's shoulder. The world kept turning. Chinadu, who had once thought himself immune to the consequences of private cruelty, found that reputations shift like cloth under harsh light. Some of his allies drifted to safer narratives. People who had once admired him in quiet rooms now chose to be seen with those whose kindness was less performative. It did not make him a villain in the public eye, so much as a complicated figure who had to account for what he had done. There was no melodramatic fall. There was a thinning of space around him until he had to decide whether to live in the less flattering light he had cast. For Ada, the real change was domestic and steady. Mensa Designs paid the rent and then paid the apprentice. The twins learned measurements and how to stretch fabric without ruining its grain. They learned that sometimes the work you do when no one watches is the work that counts most. People came for classes and left with skills and the odd courage to start something themselves. Ada taught more than hymns. She taught how to keep steady hands when life tried to scatter you. In private moments, she thought about power, not the kind printed in business magazines, but the kind that comes from choosing how to use your hands and then doing that work faithfully. Kofi never demanded she call him benefactor in public. He attended openings and sat in the periphery, smiling where appropriate and holding her friendlier than a spouse who owns a house. That arrangement suited her partnership without possession. When the season changed and the leaves spilled like confetti down the avenue, Ada sat in the studio at dusk and wound the gold thread onto a new bobbin. The spool was somewhat smaller now, the thread frayed in places and retied by fingers that had learned to be careful. She looked at her hand, small, scarred, capable, and thought about the invitation that had once read like a dare. The paper lay in a drawer, folded along its crease, a relic of an old life. She placed it in the studio's memory book rather than burning it. It was a historical note, not a pin to hang on a chest. Sometimes, friends asked if she ever felt triumphant. She would smile and say no, not like that. There was too much life to be made. Too many hems to finish. Triumph, in her vocabulary, was smaller and more domestic. It was a daughter who learned to tie the knot on her own. It was an apprentice whose work earned a proper wage. It was the day when a former client brought in a dress and admitted she'd been wrong to doubt Ada's skill. Satisfaction, for her, arrived as steady growth rather than the brittle shine of revenge. The invitation's handwriting had once been a weapon. It was now an artifact, evidence that a man had tried to orchestrate a moment and found, instead, a choice. Ada's choice had not been to humiliate or to gloat. It had been to show herself as she was. A maker, a mother, a woman who had stitched a life back together and then taught others how to do the same. Kofi's mother, at a small, quiet gathering to celebrate the studio's first anniversary, raised a cup to Ada and said something that landed in the room like a blessing you could accept without guilt. Talent, when paired with humility, passes on goodness. The room agreed with nods. The twins scuffled quietly and were told to be polite, which they did with the kind of half-hearted attention children give to adult ritual. Not every day was easy. There were nights when expenses crept like cold and a hole in the accounts made Ada hold her breath until the numbers made sense again. There were clients who wanted designs stolen or compromises made. She refused some offers that would have required the studio to sell its soul. Sometimes the refusal cost money, but it preserved the kind of dignity that could not be bought back after sale. Years later, in a quiet moment of reflection, people who had watched the brief clip of the rolls and the gold dress would compare notes. Some said the sight of Ada in that reserved seat was the perfect antidote to a culture that tries to make public shaming theatrical. Others, more practical, pointed to the small business she had built as the real victory. A sustainable studio that had employed people and taught skills and, in its own modest way, changed a neighborhood. When asked to sum it up, Ada would think of simple things. Her mother's old hem marker, the spool of gold thread, the sound of the machine at 3 a.m, the smell of starch. These were the elements that made a life. She would think too of a seat that had been offered as a provocation and turned into, in her hands, a place of witness rather than injury. She never sought the fate of Chinid. She wanted him to have the chance to become something better if he could, to learn from what he had done and change. There was no joy in watching a former abuser suffer. There was only relief that her children could grow without that presence as a constant storm. Her energies were far better spent on seams and small kindnesses. On a quiet evening, with the girls asleep and the sewing machine put away, Ada laid her hands on the gold thread and said the truth she had gathered over the years, the lesson she had stitched into her life without needing an audience to validate it. Worth, she said softly, mostly to herself, is not something other people hand to you. It is something you learn to make and keep. Her fingers moved like a metronome across the spool, and in that simple motion she found a peace that was not triumphant in the way tabloids misdescribed, but deep and honest. The woman who had been summoned to a wedding in order to be humiliated had instead come, sat, and sewn her way to a new life. The invitation that had once been a command had become, in the end, only paper in a drawer. The life that had been built afterwards, quiet, steady, generous, was the real answer. The woman he called worthless was priceless. If this story moved you, subscribe and share. We'll bring you more modern folktales about people who rise